In the early dawn of the 20th century, the world stood on the edge of an abyss. Nations armed themselves with promises of glory, unaware of the darkness that lay ahead. It was a war that was meant to end all wars, a brutal conflict that would carve scars across continents and souls alike. This is the story of World War I, told not through dates and strategies, but through the eyes of those who lived it. Soldiers in the trenches, nurses in field hospitals, pilots dancing with death in the skies. Ordinary men and women caught in an unimaginable storm. These are their stories. Moments of courage, despair, sacrifice, and survival, drawn from the bloodied fields of France, the frozen mountains of Italy, the burning deserts of the Middle East. This is not just history, this is a journey into the heart of a world on fire. The Christmas Truce of 1914. In the bitter winter of 1914, as World War I was still in its first brutal year, an extraordinary event unfolded along the Western Front. The sounds of machine guns, artillery, and desperate cries fell silent as Christmas Eve descended. In the muddy, freezing trenches of Flanders, a strange calm took over the battlefield. British and German soldiers, who had been locked in deadly combat, began to sing Christmas carols, their voices carrying over the eerie silence. Silent Night in German, Stille Nacht, was met with a response from the British side. A surreal connection had begun. As dawn broke on Christmas Day, soldiers tentatively emerged from their trenches. Instead of reaching for rifles, they extended their hands. Shouts of "Merry Christmas" in broken English and German filled the air. Men who had been bitter enemies hours before exchanged small gifts, chocolate, cigarettes, buttons, and photographs of loved ones. They even played impromptu games of football in the shell-pocked no-man's land. The truce was not an official ceasefire. It was a spontaneous outbreak of humanity that spread across several sectors of the front. Some officers tried to prevent it, fearing a loss of discipline. But for a brief time, the men in the trenches chose peace over war. Eventually, the commanders on both sides reasserted control, and the soldiers returned to their trenches. The war resumed with all its brutality, but the Christmas Truce of 1914 remained a poignant reminder of shared humanity even in the darkest of times. The use of carrier pigeons, the feathered lifelines. Amid the chaos and destruction of World War I, when telegraph lines were severed and radio communication was unreliable, an ancient method proved indispensable: carrier pigeons. These winged messengers were not just a relic of the past, they became a lifeline for soldiers on the front. Thousands of pigeons were used by all major armies to relay crucial messages from the front lines to command centers. One of the most famous pigeons was Cher Ami, a bird belonging to the U.S. Army Signal Corps. In October 1918, during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, Major Charles Whittlesey's Lost Battalion was trapped behind enemy lines, surrounded and suffering heavy casualties. Under constant enemy fire, they attempted to send runners to deliver their position, but each was killed. Desperate, they released their last pigeon, Cher Ami. The message tied to Cher Ami's leg read, "We are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." Shot through the chest, blinded in one eye, and with one leg barely hanging on, Cher Ami managed to fly 25 miles in just 25 minutes, delivering the message and saving the lives of nearly 200 men. For this act of heroism, Cher Ami was awarded the French Croix de Guerre and became a symbol of courage. Carrier pigeons were not just birds but heroes, whose bravery saved countless lives. They flew through storm, gunfire, and poisonous gas, their small wings carrying the weight of desperate human hope. The tank, the birth of modern warfare on land. The First World War marked the introduction of many new weapons and technologies, but none would have a more lasting impact on the future of warfare than the invention of the tank. The tank was conceived as a solution to the deadlock of trench warfare, where both sides were trapped in a constant struggle for small amounts of ground, with little mobility and devastating losses. The British, who were desperate for a breakthrough, developed this revolutionary machine, which would forever change the way wars were fought. The idea for a vehicle that could cross trenches and withstand enemy fire first emerged in early 1915. The British Army, stymied by the stalemate of trench warfare, sought to develop a weapon that could break through the enemy lines and lead infantry into battle. The concept of the tank was based on the idea of an armored vehicle capable of crossing difficult terrain, including trenches and barbed wire, while providing protection from small arms fire and artillery. The British government created a secret committee, known as the Landships Committee, tasked with developing this new weapon. The name landship was used to describe the machine, as it resembled a giant ship moving on land. The committee was made up of engineers, military officers, and industrialists, who worked with a sense of urgency to develop a prototype. The design they came up with was unlike anything ever seen before. The first tanks were large, clumsy machines with tracks running around the entire vehicle, allowing them to move across rough terrain. The body was made of steel plates, which provided some protection against enemy gunfire. The tanks were equipped with machine guns and, in some cases, cannons, making them formidable in combat. The early tanks were slow, awkward, and unreliable, but they represented a new way of thinking about warfare. The first use of tanks on the battlefield came on September 15, 1916, during the Battle of the Somme. A total of 49 British tanks were deployed, though only 36 actually made it into battle. The results were mixed. Many of the tanks broke down before they could reach the German lines, and those that did manage to advance were often unable to maneuver effectively. However, the sight of these massive, armored monsters rolling across no man's land terrified the German soldiers, many of whom had never seen such machines before. Though the tanks were not an immediate success on the Somme, they had a psychological impact on the enemy. The Germans had never encountered anything like the tank before, and it created a sense of dread and uncertainty. Over the course of the war, both the British and the Germans refined their tank designs, and the tank gradually became a more effective weapon. In 1917, the British used tanks more effectively in the Battle of Cambrai. This time, they deployed 476 tanks, which were able to breach German defenses and advance deep into enemy territory. The battle marked the first large-scale use of tanks and showed the potential of these machines in modern warfare. Although the British were eventually forced to retreat due to a lack of infantry support, the tanks had proven their worth as a weapon that could punch through the most fortified positions. The tank also had a profound impact on military strategy. No longer would wars be fought solely by infantry charging across open fields or artillery bombarding the enemy from a distance. The tank, with its combination of firepower and mobility, became an essential part of modern armies. In the years after World War I, tanks would be further developed, leading to the creation of the large armored divisions that would play such a key role in World War II. The tank's development during World War I was not without its challenges. The early models were prone to mechanical breakdowns, had poor visibility, and were extremely slow. The crews often found themselves trapped inside the tanks in oppressive heat or cold, and many died from exhaustion, suffocation, or wounds during battles. The tanks were also vulnerable to artillery fire and anti-tank weapons, which would later become more effective as technology advanced. Nevertheless, the tank was a game-changer. It represented a fundamental shift in how wars would be fought, and its legacy can be seen in the modern armored vehicles used by armies today. The idea of a mobile, heavily armored unit that could break through enemy lines and support infantry advances was revolutionary, and the tank became the hallmark of modern mechanized warfare. Today, the tanks of World War I seem primitive by comparison to the sophisticated machines of the 21st century. Yet, they laid the groundwork for the massive armored divisions that would come to dominate battlefields in the future. The birth of the tank on the muddy fields of the Somme and Cambrai was a defining moment in military history, one that changed the face of warfare forever. The Battle of Verdun, a monument to attrition and endurance. The Battle of Verdun, fought from February 21 to December 18, 1916, remains one of the longest, bloodiest, and most grueling engagements of World War I. It was a battle of attrition, where both the French and German armies would seek to wear each other down through constant, brutal fighting. Verdun was not just a military confrontation, but a symbol of the war's horrific scale, where the immense human cost seemed almost inconceivable, and the land itself became a vast graveyard for both sides. The battle began with the German army's desire to bleed France white. General Erich von Falkenhayn, the German chief of staff, believed that by attacking the French at Verdun, a stronghold on the Western Front, he could force them into a war of attrition. He wanted to strike at the heart of France, where the French national psyche was deeply tied to the region's strategic importance. The Germans intended to capture the fortress and its surrounding areas, thereby crippling France's morale and potentially securing a decisive victory. Verdun was a critical point in the French defensive system, with numerous fortifications built to protect the region. The French army, under the command of Philippe Pétain, who would later become a prominent figure in French history, was determined to hold the line at all costs. Pétain's famous rallying cry, "They shall not pass," became a symbol of French resolve during the battle. On February 21, 1916, the Germans launched their assault, beginning with a massive artillery barrage that would last for several days. The Germans aimed to destroy the French fortifications, neutralize the defenders, and prepare the way for a full infantry assault. The bombardment, which was one of the heaviest of the war, tore the landscape apart, turning it into a landscape of craters and rubble. The French responded fiercely, with the 16th Division holding the initial line. However, as the Germans advanced, they pushed deeper into the French defensive positions. The German forces, utilizing a combination of infantry, artillery, and poison gas, managed to capture several French forts, but the French resistance remained resilient. The battle devolved into a deadly exchange of artillery fire, with each side attempting to destroy the other's positions. The land around Verdun was reduced to a wasteland of mud, shell holes, and desolation. As the battle dragged on through the spring and summer, the French forces began to rotate troops in and out of the line to maintain their strength. The soldiers who fought at Verdun were subjected to unimaginable hardships. The constant shelling, the mud, the lack of food, and the ever-present fear of gas attacks all wore down the morale of the men. Yet, despite these conditions, the French held firm, refusing to give up the ground. The psychological toll of the battle was also immense. Verdun became a symbol of French endurance. The men who fought there were known as poilus, or hairy ones, a term that symbolized both the ruggedness and the grueling nature of their survival. The phrase, "They shall not pass," became an emblem of national unity, and the French people rallied around the defense of Verdun as a patriotic cause. By the summer of 1916, the Germans had made only modest gains. The French, meanwhile, had reinforced their positions, bringing in additional troops and supplies. In July, the French launched a counteroffensive under General Nivelle, and despite suffering heavy casualties, they managed to recapture some of the ground lost earlier in the battle. As the months passed, both sides suffered staggering losses. The French army alone lost more than 350,000 men, while the Germans also sustained heavy casualties, with estimates reaching around 350,000 as well. The total number of casualties, including the wounded, was far higher. The battlefield at Verdun had become a vast cemetery, with many soldiers buried in unmarked graves or left to rot in the open fields. The terrain, once green and fertile, was permanently scarred by war. The battle finally ended in December 1916, with neither side achieving a decisive victory. Verdun remained in French hands, but the cost was catastrophic. The war of attrition had drained both nations of precious resources and manpower. Verdun had become a symbol of the futility of the war, a place where countless lives were sacrificed for little more than symbolic victory. After the battle, Verdun was transformed into a monument, a place of remembrance for the fallen. The French continued to honor those who fought there, and the city itself became a focal point for national mourning. Verdun would forever be remembered as a monument to human endurance and the horrors of war, a place where, amid the carnage, the human spirit endured against the unrelenting forces of destruction. The Harlem Hellfighters, heroes of two fronts. In the segregated United States of 1917, African-American men who volunteered to serve in World War I found themselves facing prejudice not just from their own country but within their own army. Yet, one unit rose above the racism, earning glory and respect on the battlefields of France, the 369th Infantry Regiment, known as the Harlem Hellfighters. Formed in New York City, the Harlem Hellfighters were initially assigned to labor duties, digging ditches and unloading supplies. But the French, desperate for reinforcements, requested American troops, and the Hellfighters were transferred to the French army. The French welcomed them with open arms, providing them with French rifles, helmets, and equipment. On the front lines, the Hellfighters distinguished themselves with unmatched courage. One of their most celebrated heroes was Private Henry Johnson. During a brutal night raid in no man's land, Johnson and his comrade Needham Roberts were attacked by a dozen German soldiers. Johnson, though wounded, fought ferociously, using his rifle, a Boileau knife, and his bare hands to repel the enemy, saving Roberts and earning the nickname Black Death. The Harlem Hellfighters spent 191 continuous days in combat, more than any other American unit. They never lost a foot of ground, never had a man captured, and earned the French Croix de Guerre, France's highest military honor. But upon their return to the United States, they were greeted not as heroes, but with the same prejudice they had left behind. The story of the Harlem Hellfighters is a tale of courage, loyalty, and resilience, a group of men who fought bravely for a country that did not yet see them as equals. The mysterious death of the Red Baron, the fall of a legend. Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, was a name that struck terror in the skies of World War I. A German fighter pilot with 80 confirmed aerial victories, he was a master of the dogfight, a symbol of chivalry and deadly skill. His distinctive red Fokker triplane became an iconic symbol of his legend. But on April 21, 1918, the legend of the Red Baron came to a sudden, mysterious end. Flying low over the trenches near Vaux-sur-Somme, Richthofen was engaged in a fierce pursuit of a British Sopwith Camel piloted by Canadian novice Wilfred Wap May. But as he chased his prey, Richthofen himself became the hunted. A squadron of British fighters joined the fray, led by Captain Roy Brown. As the dogfight swirled overhead, ground fire erupted from the trenches below. Suddenly, Richthofen's triplane wavered, then crashed into a field. Australian troops rushed to the wreckage and found the Red Baron dead, a single bullet wound through his chest. Who killed the Red Baron? Theories abound. Some credit Captain Roy Brown with the fatal shot, others claim an Australian machine gunner on the ground fired the bullet that struck Richthofen. What is certain is that the Red Baron died with dignity, his body laid to rest with full military honors by the Allied troops who had once feared him. The Red Baron became a legend, not just for his skill as a pilot but for the mystery of his death, a tale of glory, honor, and the tragic fate of even the greatest warriors. The Gallipoli Campaign, a tragic gamble on the shores of Dardanelles. The Gallipoli Campaign of 1915 to 1916 was one of the most ambitious but ultimately disastrous operations of World War I, intended to break the deadlock on the Western Front and secure a new front against the Ottoman Empire. It became a brutal struggle marked by strategic blunders, heroic resistance, and a profound human cost. For the Allied troops who landed on the rocky, unforgiving beaches of the Gallipoli Peninsula, it was a nightmare of trench warfare, heat, disease, and death. The roots of the campaign lay in the desperation of the Allied leadership to find a way to outmaneuver the Germans and their allies. The Ottoman Empire, which had joined the Central Powers, controlled the vital Strait of the Dardanelles, the gateway between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Control of the Dardanelles would allow the Allies to supply their Russian allies more effectively and strike at the heart of the Ottoman Empire. It was Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, who championed the idea of an amphibious assault to seize the straits. The campaign began with a naval assault in February 1915, but the Allied fleet, composed of British and French warships, was met with fierce resistance. Ottoman coastal guns, hidden in the cliffs, and deadly minefields sank or damaged several Allied ships. The naval assault failed, but rather than abandon the plan, the Allies shifted to a full-scale land invasion. On April 25, 1915, British, French, Australian, and New Zealand troops, known as Anzacs, Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, landed at various points along the Gallipoli Peninsula. But from the very beginning, the invasion was plagued by chaos. Poor planning, outdated maps, and a lack of coordination led to confusion. Many of the Anzacs landed in the wrong places, facing steep, rocky cliffs rather than the flat beaches they had expected. Turkish defenders, led by the determined and brilliant young officer Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, fought with fierce determination, exploiting the terrain to their advantage. The fighting quickly devolved into a brutal struggle for every inch of ground. The Allies found themselves trapped on narrow beachheads, their attempts to push inland thwarted by Turkish machine guns, artillery, and relentless counterattacks. The conditions were appalling. Soldiers fought under the scorching sun, with little fresh water, while flies and disease spread rapidly through the trenches. Dysentery became rampant, and the stench of rotting corpses filled the air. As the weeks turned to months, the Allies launched a series of offensives in an attempt to break the deadlock. At Suvla Bay, another landing was attempted in August, but poor leadership and confusion among the commanders meant that the opportunity for a breakthrough was lost. The Turkish defenders, with Mustafa Kemal's leadership, continued to hold firm, their morale bolstered by the knowledge that they were defending their homeland. The soldiers who fought on both sides endured unimaginable suffering. The narrow trenches, often just a few yards apart, were a place of constant danger. Snipers, artillery shells, and sudden attacks made death a constant companion. For the Anzac troops, who had traveled halfway around the world to fight, the realization that they were trapped in a stalemate was a bitter one. Yet they fought on, and their courage and sacrifice became a source of national pride for Australia and New Zealand, even as their losses mounted. By late 1915, it became clear that the campaign had failed. The Allied leadership, including Winston Churchill, who had championed the attack, faced intense criticism. The decision was made to evacuate. In one of the few successful aspects of the campaign, the evacuation was carried out with remarkable efficiency. Using clever deception tactics, such as rigged rifles that fired automatically at random intervals, the Allies were able to withdraw without alerting the Turkish defenders. On January 9, 1916, the last Allied troops left Gallipoli. The cost of the campaign was staggering. The Allies suffered over 250,000 casualties, including more than 46,000 dead. The Ottoman forces also paid a terrible price, with over 250,000 casualties of their own. Yet, for the Ottomans, the victory was a rare and significant triumph in a war that would eventually see their empire collapse. The impact of Gallipoli was far-reaching. For the British, it was a humiliating defeat, one that damaged Churchill's career for a time. For Australia and New Zealand, it was a moment of national awakening. The Anzacs' courage in the face of overwhelming odds became a defining moment in their national histories, and April 25, known as Anzac Day, became a day of remembrance. For the Ottoman Empire, the victory at Gallipoli was a source of immense pride, and it elevated Mustafa Kemal to the status of a national hero. He would later lead the Turkish War of Independence and become the founding father of the Republic of Turkey. The beaches and cliffs of Gallipoli remain today as a place of pilgrimage, a place where the graves of the fallen stand as silent witnesses to the courage, suffering, and futility of war. Gallipoli is remembered not only as a military campaign but as a profound human tragedy, a place where ordinary soldiers were asked to perform extraordinary deeds in a hopeless cause. The sinking of the Lusitania, a tragedy that altered the course of history. On May 7, 1915, one of the deadliest maritime disasters of the early 20th century occurred, forever altering the course of World War I and shifting global attitudes toward the conflict. The sinking of the British ocean liner RMS Lusitania was not only a tragedy in itself but also a critical event that helped push the United States into the war. The Lusitania was one of the largest and fastest passenger ships in the world, renowned for its luxury and elegance. Owned by the Cunard Line, the ship was a symbol of British maritime power and was regularly used for transatlantic voyages between Europe and North America. On May 1, 1915, the Lusitania set sail from New York City, heading to Liverpool, England. The ship carried over 1,900 people, including passengers and crew, and was packed with a mix of civilians, including wealthy socialites and immigrants, along with a large number of Americans. At this time, World War I was raging in Europe, and the British blockade of Germany was severely restricting German access to supplies. In retaliation, Germany had declared the waters around the British Isles a war zone and announced that any ships entering the area could be attacked. Although the Lusitania was a civilian vessel, the German government claimed it was carrying munitions, which, while not entirely untrue, was heavily debated. The ship was indeed carrying some arms and ammunition, but its primary purpose was commercial, transporting civilians across the Atlantic. Despite Germany's warnings to the public, the British and American governments dismissed the threat, and the Lusitania continued its journey, unprotected by an escort. On the afternoon of May 7, as the ship neared the Irish coast, disaster struck. A German U-boat, U-20, under the command of Captain Walther Schwieger, spotted the Lusitania. Without warning, Schwieger fired a torpedo at the ship. The explosion was catastrophic. The Lusitania's massive hull tore apart, and within just 18 minutes, the ship sank to the bottom of the ocean. The aftermath of the attack was horrifying. Of the 1,962 people on board, 1,198 lost their lives, including 128 Americans. The vast majority of the casualties were civilians, and many of those who perished were women and children. The destruction of the Lusitania sent shockwaves through both the British and American public. The event was seen as an unprovoked attack on a civilian vessel, and it created an immense outcry, particularly in the United States. The sinking of the Lusitania ignited fierce anger, especially in America, where the loss of life was seen as an act of barbarism by Germany. American public opinion, which had been divided on entering the war, turned sharply against Germany. The event provided a rallying point for those who advocated for the United States to abandon its neutrality. While President Woodrow Wilson refrained from immediately declaring war, he sent a strong diplomatic protest to Germany. The sinking of the Lusitania became one of the major incidents that eventually pushed the U.S. into World War I in 1917, after years of maintaining a stance of neutrality. Germany, on the other hand, faced mounting criticism. The attack on the Lusitania was perceived as a violation of international law and a brutal strike against innocent civilians. Although the German government defended the attack, claiming that the Lusitania was a legitimate military target due to the munitions it carried, the incident caused international outrage. In response, Germany reluctantly promised to restrict its submarine warfare tactics in order to avoid further alienating neutral countries, especially the United States. However, the damage was already done, and the public relations fallout from the attack would never fully subside. In the long term, the sinking of the Lusitania had far-reaching consequences. It played a significant role in shifting public opinion in favor of the Allied powers and contributed to the growing pressure on the U.S. government to enter the war. The tragic loss of life underscored the dangers of unrestricted submarine warfare and the vulnerability of civilian ships during wartime. It also highlighted the complex dynamics of modern warfare, where acts of violence against civilians could no longer be ignored or easily justified. Today, the sinking of the Lusitania remains one of the most iconic events of World War I, and the wreck of the ship, which rests on the ocean floor off the coast of Ireland, serves as a somber reminder of the human cost of war and the fragile nature of peace. The Battle of the Somme, a bloodbath in the trenches. The Battle of the Somme, which raged from July 1 to November 18, 1916, was one of the largest and bloodiest battles of World War I. It was a conflict defined by the horrific conditions of trench warfare, unimaginable loss of life, and a struggle for just a few miles of shattered, muddy ground. For Britain, it would become a symbol of the tragic cost of war. The origins of the battle lay in the Allied desire to break the stalemate of trench warfare on the Western Front. The French and British commanders, facing the horrific losses at Verdun, planned a major offensive along the Somme River in northern France. The Somme was chosen because it was where British and French forces met, allowing for a coordinated attack. But as the Battle of Verdun raged on, the French could offer fewer troops than initially planned, leaving the British to take the lead. The attack was preceded by a massive artillery bombardment, lasting 7 days. British commanders believed that this bombardment would obliterate the German defenses, destroy the barbed wire, and allow their troops to simply walk across no man's land. Over 1.5 million shells were fired at the German lines. But the Germans were not easily broken. They had dug deep, reinforced bunkers that sheltered their troops from the relentless shelling, and much of the barbed wire remained intact. On the morning of July 1, 1916, the British soldiers climbed out of their trenches and advanced towards the German lines. They were met with a horrific surprise. The German machine guns, virtually untouched by the bombardment, opened up with murderous fire. Wave after wave of British soldiers were cut down in the open fields. Entire battalions were wiped out within minutes. In just one day, the British suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, making it the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. Despite this devastating loss, British commanders, including General Douglas Haig, pressed on with the offensive. The fighting became a brutal, grinding struggle for tiny patches of land. Villages like Thiepval, Beaumont Hamel, and Mametz became names synonymous with suffering. Troops fought in mud-filled craters, shattered forests, and ruined villages, with death a constant companion. Among the horrors of the battle was the use of the first tanks in combat. The British introduced these armored vehicles in September 1916, hoping they would break the deadlock. But the early tanks were unreliable, slow, and prone to breakdowns. Many were destroyed by German artillery, and their impact on the battle was limited. The soldiers who fought in the Somme endured unimaginable conditions. The trenches were often filled with water, and soldiers lived alongside rats and lice. Shell shock, a condition we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, was rampant. Many men who survived physically were forever scarred by the horrors they witnessed. Yet despite the suffering, the battle continued. As the weeks turned to months, the Allies made slow, bloody progress. Villages were taken and lost, then retaken at a terrible cost. The Germans, for their part, defended tenaciously, retreating only when their positions became completely untenable. By November, with the onset of winter, the battle finally ended. The Allies had advanced a mere 6 miles, at the cost of over 1 million men on both sides, including more than 400,000 British casualties. The outcome of the Battle of the Somme was a bitter and sobering experience for the British. The offensive, which had been intended to achieve a breakthrough, had instead turned into a war of attrition. While it did relieve pressure on the French at Verdun and inflicted heavy losses on the Germans, it exposed the futility of frontal assaults against fortified positions. The landscape of the Somme was left a desolate wasteland of mud, craters, and twisted barbed wire. The bodies of the dead, many of whom were never recovered, lay buried beneath the shattered earth. The villages that had once dotted the region were reduced to ruins. For Britain, the Somme became a national tragedy. The names of the fallen filled newspapers and were inscribed on memorials across the country. The battle's horrors were immortalized in the poetry of soldiers like Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, whose haunting words captured the grief, rage, and disillusionment of a generation. Yet despite the catastrophic losses, the British Army learned painful but valuable lessons. New tactics, including the use of creeping barrages and more effective coordination between infantry, artillery, and tanks, would eventually shape British strategy in the later stages of the war. But the Somme would forever be remembered as a battle where the courage of ordinary soldiers collided with the cold, calculated strategy of commanders, a place where idealism died in the mud of no man's land. The Zimmermann Telegram, a secret that changed history. In early 1917, the Great War had already ravaged Europe for nearly 3 years. The United States remained neutral, though increasingly sympathetic to the Allies, especially after the sinking of the Lusitania. But a secret message would soon shatter American neutrality and thrust the nation into the conflict: the Zimmermann Telegram. The coded message. On January 16, 1917, German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann sent a secret telegram to the German ambassador in Mexico, Heinrich von Eckhardt. The message, encrypted in diplomatic code, proposed a daring alliance. If the United States entered the war against Germany, Mexico should declare war on the United States. In return, Germany promised Mexico that it would regain its lost territories, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. But the message did not reach its destination undisturbed. The British Intelligence Service, which had long been tapping transatlantic cables, intercepted and decoded the telegram. Shocked by its contents, the British government faced a delicate dilemma: how to use the message without revealing that they were spying on diplomatic communications. The revelation. On February 24, 1917, the British presented the decoded telegram to the American ambassador in London, who quickly forwarded it to Washington. At first, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson was skeptical, fearing a British trick to lure America into the war. But when Germany, astonishingly, confirmed the telegram's authenticity, American outrage exploded. Newspapers published the text of the Zimmermann telegram, and public opinion, which had been divided on the war, shifted sharply against Germany. American citizens who had been wary of European entanglements were now furious at the thought of German conspiracies on their doorstep. Mexico's refusal and the American decision. Ironically, Mexico itself had no intention of joining such a reckless gamble. Mexican leaders knew their country was too weak to fight the United States, and they viewed the German offer as impractical. But the damage was done. The mere existence of the telegram painted Germany as a treacherous aggressor willing to use America's neighbors against it. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. American soldiers, doughboys, would soon cross the Atlantic, bringing fresh energy and resources to the Allied cause. The Zimmermann telegram, a single secret message, had changed the course of history, transforming a European war into a truly global conflict. The Battle of Passchendaele, a sea of mud and sacrifice. In the summer of 1917, the British High Command launched an offensive in Flanders, aiming to break through German lines and capture the vital Belgian town of Passchendaele. Officially known as the Third Battle of Ypres, it would become forever known by the name of this shattered village, Passchendaele, a symbol of horror, futility, and unimaginable suffering. The attack began with a relentless artillery barrage, the earth shaking for days as nearly 4 million shells pounded German positions. But the bombardment churned the Flanders lowlands into a quagmire. Heavy rain followed, turning the scarred battlefield into a vast, stinking morass of mud. Soldiers found themselves wading through knee-deep, sometimes waist-deep, muck. Men, horses, and even tanks were swallowed by the mire. Many who fell wounded drowned where they lay. The initial British assaults made modest gains, but German defences, well prepared and dug into concrete pillboxes, remained largely intact. As the rain continued, the battlefield became a grotesque vision of hell. Trenches collapsed, and the waterlogged ground swallowed bodies whole. The smell of decay was ever present, and the cries of the wounded mixed with the ceaseless roar of artillery. Canadian forces were brought in to spearhead the final push. These soldiers, battle-hardened from Vimy Ridge, fought their way inch by bloody inch across the shattered landscape. Machine guns swept through ranks of advancing men, shells plowed the mud, and the dead lay thick on the ground. But the Canadians pressed on, driven by determination and sacrifice. On November 6, 1917, the ruins of Passchendaele village finally fell to the Allies. The ground they had captured was a desolate, cratered wasteland, a Pyrrhic victory. In over 3 months of fighting, the British Empire suffered nearly 275,000 casualties, the Germans slightly fewer. The village they had fought so hard to take was obliterated, and the strategic impact of the battle was minimal. Passchendaele became a bitter symbol of the horror of trench warfare. A place where bravery and sacrifice were drowned in mud. The Armenian Genocide, a dark chapter in history. In the spring of 1915, as the Ottoman Empire grappled with the pressures of war and internal discontent, a horrific campaign against the empire's Armenian population began. What followed would become one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century, the Armenian Genocide. The roots of this tragedy lay in a complex mix of ethnic, political, and religious tensions. The Armenians, an ancient Christian people, had long lived within the Ottoman Empire. While many Armenians had been loyal subjects of the empire, they were also viewed with suspicion by Ottoman authorities, especially as the empire began to crumble under the pressures of modernity, internal rebellion, and the threat of external enemies during World War I. In 1915, the Ottoman government, now controlled by the Committee of Union and Progress, embarked on a brutal campaign of mass deportation, starvation, and slaughter of the Armenians, who were accused of collaborating with Russia, the Ottoman Empire's enemy in the war. The government's decision to relocate the Armenians from their homes to remote parts of the empire was cloaked under the guise of military necessity, but it soon became clear that it was a systematic attempt to annihilate an entire population. Armenians were forced from their homes in the dead of night, without food, water, or shelter. They were marched through barren deserts, with little regard for the weak, the elderly, or the children who could not keep pace. Along the way, many were subjected to rape, torture, and execution. The marches became death marches. Hundreds of thousands of Armenians perished under these harrowing conditions, their bodies left to rot under the brutal sun. At the same time, thousands of men were rounded up and executed outright by Ottoman forces. The most heinous acts occurred in the cities and towns where Armenians were concentrated. In some cases, entire villages were wiped out, with women and children particularly vulnerable to abduction and violence. The true scope of the genocide is difficult to calculate, but it is estimated that between 1 and 1.5 million Armenians were killed or died as a result of the brutal policies. Entire communities were destroyed, and the Armenian people were dispersed across the globe, with large populations settling in countries like the United States, France, and Russia. Despite the overwhelming evidence of the genocide, the Ottoman government initially denied the scale of the atrocities, and even today, many still refuse to recognize it as genocide, despite recognition by numerous historians and governments worldwide. The tragedy is not only a painful chapter in Armenian history but also a stark reminder of the devastating impact of ethnic hatred, imperial decline, and unchecked power. The Armenian genocide remains a deeply significant issue in international relations, particularly in the ongoing struggles of the Armenian people for recognition and justice. The memory of those lost continues to live on in Armenian culture, especially on April 24, known as Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day. The Russian Revolution, the fall of the Tsar and the rise of communism. The Russian Revolution of 1917 was one of the most significant events of the 20th century, marking the end of over 3 centuries of Romanov rule and setting the stage for the establishment of the Soviet Union. It was a revolution of immense historical consequence, born from the suffering of the Russian people and the political, social, and economic turmoil exacerbated by World War I. By early 1917, Russia was in a state of collapse. Tsar Nicholas II's autocratic rule had led the country into disaster. The Tsar's decision to enter World War I in 1914 had drained Russia's resources, decimated its army, and exacerbated food shortages. The Russian army was in disarray, with soldiers deserting and morale at an all-time low. At home, there were widespread protests over poor working conditions, high inflation, and the lack of reforms. In February 1917, these tensions erupted. Strikes and protests in Petrograd, now St. Petersburg, turned into full-scale unrest. Workers and soldiers, frustrated by the ongoing war and the hardships they faced, took to the streets demanding bread, peace, and an end to the Tsarist regime. The protests were initially ignored, but by the 23rd of February, the unrest spread to other cities, and the situation became untenable for the government. On March 2, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate after losing the support of the military, his key pillar of power. A provisional government was established, but it lacked authority and faced widespread discontent. This marked the end of the Russian Empire after over 300 years of Romanov rule. But while the fall of the Tsar marked the end of one regime, it also set the stage for a more radical transformation. The February Revolution did not bring the desired stability to Russia. The provisional government, led by liberal and moderate socialist leaders, failed to pull Russia out of the war, which remained deeply unpopular, and was unable to address the pressing needs of the people. In response, more radical factions began to organize and grow in power. Among them were the Bolsheviks, a Marxist faction led by Vladimir Lenin, who sought not just political reform but the total overthrow of the capitalist system in favor of a socialist state. The Bolsheviks, through their slogan, "Peace, Land, and Bread," promised to address the discontent of the workers, soldiers, and peasants. They quickly gained support, especially in Petrograd and other urban areas, as their message resonated with a populace weary of war and revolution. On October 25, 1917, Julian calendar, November 7 on the Gregorian calendar, the Bolsheviks staged a coup against the provisional government. Lenin and his fellow revolutionary Leon Trotsky orchestrated the storming of the Winter Palace, the seat of the provisional government. The overthrow was, to many observers, swift and relatively bloodless, although violence soon erupted in the streets as the Bolsheviks consolidated their power. After the October Revolution, Lenin and the Bolsheviks moved swiftly to eliminate opposition. The provisional government was arrested, and key institutions were nationalized. Lenin, now the head of the new government, withdrew Russia from World War I by signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, which ceded large portions of Russian territory but allowed the Bolshevik government to focus on consolidating power internally. The following years saw the Bolshevik leadership facing a fierce opposition. The Russian Civil War broke out in 1918 between the Red Army, Bolsheviks, and the White Army, a loose coalition of monarchists, republicans, and anti-Bolshevik forces. The Civil War was brutal and resulted in millions of deaths, not only from combat but also from famine, disease, and the harsh measures taken by both sides. The victory of the Bolsheviks, achieved by 1922, solidified the creation of the Soviet Union. Lenin's policies transformed Russia into a one-party, socialist state, leading to a centralization of power and the beginning of collectivization. This revolution marked a dramatic shift in global politics, as the first communist state was born. The Russian Revolution had far-reaching consequences. It led directly to the rise of Joseph Stalin, who would turn the Soviet Union into a totalitarian state, and it inspired communist movements worldwide. The revolution also shaped the course of the 20th century, playing a significant role in the creation of Cold War tensions and the eventual emergence of the Soviet Union as a superpower. The shell shock crisis. World War I did not just wound the body, it shattered the mind. As the war dragged on, new, devastating condition emerged among soldiers: shell shock. Men who had been strong and courageous were suddenly paralyzed with fear, suffering from tremors, nightmares, loss of speech, and uncontrollable weeping. Some became catatonic, unable to move or speak. Doctors at first had no idea how to treat these men. Some believed they were cowards, but as the cases mounted, it became clear that this was something new, a psychological wound inflicted by the unimaginable horrors of trench warfare. The constant barrage of artillery, the screams of the dying, the sight of friends being torn apart, all of it took a severe toll on soldiers' mental health. The British Army, overwhelmed by the crisis, set up special hospitals to treat shell shock victims. Drive W.H.R. Rivers, a pioneering psychiatrist, developed compassionate treatments, listening to soldiers' stories and helping them process their trauma. Yet many were sent back to the front, still suffering, or were stigmatized as weak. The legacy of shell shock led to a greater understanding of psychological trauma in war and laid the groundwork for what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. But for many of the men who suffered, it was a silent, invisible wound they would carry for the rest of their lives. The poison gas nightmare. World War I marked the terrifying introduction of chemical warfare, forever altering the nature of combat. The first major use of poison gas occurred on April 22, 1915, during the Second Battle of Ypres, when German forces released a thick, yellow-green cloud of chlorine gas. The effect was immediate and horrifying. Soldiers who inhaled the toxic fumes coughed violently, their lungs burned, and many suffocated to death as their respiratory systems failed. Panic spread as men fled, many blinded or choking. To counter the gas, soldiers resorted to desperate measures. They used urine-soaked cloths over their mouths and noses until gas masks were developed. But even gas masks could not provide complete protection, especially against new, more lethal gases like phosgene and mustard gas. Mustard gas, first used in 1917, was especially horrific. It didn't just target the lungs, it caused severe chemical burns on any exposed skin. Soldiers blinded, blistered, and writhing in agony became a common sight in field hospitals. Gas warfare was a brutal weapon of terror. Although it did not decisively win battles, it inflicted profound psychological and physical trauma. By the end of the war, international treaties were established to ban the use of poison gas, recognizing the sheer inhumanity of chemical warfare. The Spanish flu pandemic. As World War I drew to a close in 1918, another deadly enemy emerged: the Spanish flu pandemic. It spread rapidly across the globe, infecting one-third of the world's population and killing an estimated 50 million people. Soldiers, weakened by malnutrition, injury, and the stress of war, were particularly vulnerable. The virus struck with brutal speed. Healthy young men would develop a fever, experience chills and muscle pain, and within hours, some would be dead. The crowded and unsanitary conditions of military camps and troop transport ships created a perfect environment for the virus to thrive. Ironically, the war itself helped spread the pandemic. Troops moved across continents, carrying the disease with them. Newspapers, censored due to wartime restrictions, were slow to report on the outbreak, except in neutral Spain, giving the false impression that Spain was the epicenter of the illness, hence the name Spanish flu. The pandemic killed more people than the war itself, leaving a world already devastated by conflict struggling to cope with an invisible, deadly enemy. Entire villages were wiped out, and hospitals were overwhelmed. The Spanish flu remains one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, a grim epilogue to the suffering of World War I. The Lost Battalion. In October 1918, during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, Major Charles Whittlesey led nearly 600 men of the U.S. 77th Division into the dense, misty forests of the Argonne. His unit, known later as the Lost Battalion, found themselves cut off behind enemy lines, surrounded by German forces. For 6 grueling days, Whittlesey and his men faced constant artillery shelling, sniper fire, and hunger. They had little food, little water, and no way to contact their commanders. Desperation grew as the men realized they were alone. They attempted to send a carrier pigeon named Cher Ami with a message to their lines, and against all odds, she delivered it, saving many lives. Though heavily outnumbered, the Lost Battalion held their ground until reinforcements finally broke through. Of the nearly 600 men who entered the forest, only 194 walked out. Major Whittlesey and his men became symbols of American bravery and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. The Miracle of the Marne. In September 1914, just weeks after the war began, the German army was advancing rapidly towards Paris. Victory seemed within their grasp. But as the Germans crossed the Marne River, French and British forces launched a desperate counterattack. French taxis, famously, were used to rush soldiers to the front. This bold resistance forced the Germans to retreat, dashing their hopes of a quick victory. The Battle of the Marne saved Paris and set the stage for 4 years of grueling trench warfare. The Battle of Jutland, the Clash of Dreadnoughts. The Battle of Jutland, fought between May 31 and June 1, 1916, was the largest naval battle of World War I and the only full-scale clash of battleships, the mighty dreadnoughts, between the British Royal Navy and the Imperial German Navy. It was a confrontation meant to determine naval supremacy in the North Sea, a critical theater of the war. Yet, despite the immense scale and ferocity of the battle, it ended in a controversial and inconclusive outcome, with both sides claiming victory. The origins of the battle lay in the German desire to challenge British naval supremacy. The Royal Navy's Grand Fleet, based at Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands, was the most powerful naval force in the world. It maintained a blockade of Germany, strangling the Central Powers' economy and limiting their ability to sustain the war effort. The German High Seas Fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Reinhard Scheer, sought to break this blockade by luring out a portion of the Grand Fleet and destroying it in a decisive engagement. Scheer's plan was to use a smaller force of battlecruisers under Vice Admiral Franz von Hipper to lure the British battlecruiser fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Sir David Beatty, into an ambush where the full might of the High Seas Fleet would fall upon them. The British, however, were not entirely unaware of German intentions. Thanks to their success in breaking German naval codes, the British Admiralty knew that the German fleet was preparing for action, and Admiral Sir John Jellicoe, commander of the Grand Fleet, sailed out to intercept them. On the afternoon of May 31, the battle began with an encounter between the two battlecruiser forces. Beatty's battlecruisers, fast but lightly armored, engaged Hipper's ships in a running battle. The opening exchanges were catastrophic for the British. The battlecruiser HMS Indefatigable was struck by German shells, which penetrated its magazine, causing a massive explosion that tore the ship apart, killing nearly all of its crew. Minutes later, HMS Queen Mary met the same fate, shattered by a thunderous explosion that left only a handful of survivors. Beatty, watching his ships explode in flames, famously remarked to his flag officer, "There seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today." The problem lay in the poor handling of ammunition aboard the British battlecruisers, where flash protection was often sacrificed for faster rate of fire, making them vulnerable to catastrophic explosions. Despite these losses, Beatty's force succeeded in leading the German battlecruisers towards the main body of the British Grand Fleet under Jellicoe. As the full might of both fleets came into contact, over 250 ships and more than 100,000 sailors took part in a chaotic, swirling naval engagement. The great ships, their grey hulls looming above the waves, fired broadsides at each other, their massive guns creating sheets of flame and towering geysers of water where shells missed. Amid the smoke and chaos, Jellicoe skillfully maneuvered the Grand Fleet into a position to cross the T of the German fleet, allowing his ships to bring their full broadside firepower to bear on the advancing Germans. It was a classic maneuver of naval warfare, one that placed the German fleet at a severe disadvantage. Yet, despite this tactical success, the Germans fought back with incredible determination. Their ships were well built, with superior armor protection, and they were able to withstand British shells that often failed to penetrate. As darkness fell, the battle raged on, with both sides suffering heavy losses. German ships like SMS Lutzow and SMS Seydlitz were severely damaged but managed to limp away. The British also lost several ships, including the armored cruisers HMS Defence and HMS Black Prince, which were destroyed with almost all hands. Night brought confusion, as ships maneuvered through the darkness, firing at each other in brief, chaotic clashes. By the morning of June 1, Scheer realized that his fleet was in danger of being encircled and gave the order to retreat. Skillfully using smoke screens and aggressive destroyer attacks, the Germans managed to slip away, leaving the British to claim control of the battlefield. Yet, despite their tactical success in forcing the Germans to withdraw, the British had not achieved the decisive victory they sought. The Grand Fleet returned to Scapa Flow, battered but still intact. The Germans, though they had suffered severe damage, also claimed victory because they had inflicted more direct losses on the British fleet. In terms of losses, the British suffered more, losing 14 ships and over 6,000 men. The Germans lost 11 ships and just over 2,500 men. But the true outcome of the battle was more complex. Strategically, the British maintained their blockade of Germany, and the German High Seas Fleet, despite its tactical success, never again seriously challenged the Royal Navy's dominance of the North Sea. The British fleet, though battered, remained a formidable force, while the German fleet was effectively confined to port for the remainder of the war. The Battle of Jutland became a subject of intense debate in Britain. Admiral Jellicoe, criticized by some for his cautious approach, defended his conduct by pointing out that he had preserved the Grand Fleet, which was essential to maintaining British naval supremacy. Churchill famously remarked that Jellicoe was the only man on either side who could lose the war in an afternoon, underscoring the immense responsibility placed on his shoulders. For Germany, the battle was a bitter realization that their fleet, despite its skill and courage, could not break the British blockade. The failure of the High Seas Fleet to achieve a decisive victory led the German leadership to intensify their policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, a decision that would eventually draw the United States into the war. Jutland is remembered today not as a triumphant victory, but as a testament to the power and horror of industrialized naval warfare. The vast, wind-swept North Sea, where the wrecks of the sunken ships still lie on the ocean floor, remains a silent witness to the ferocity of that great clash of steel leviathans. The Brusilov Offensive, Russia's last triumph. The Brusilov Offensive of 1916 was one of the most successful Allied operations of World War I, a brilliant and devastating Russian assault against the Austro-Hungarian Empire on the Eastern Front. Named after its mastermind, General Alexei Brusilov, this offensive shattered enemy lines, inflicted staggering losses, and demonstrated the potential of innovative military tactics. Yet, it was also a tragic high point for Russia, a victory that came at a terrible cost and could not prevent the turmoil that would soon engulf the Russian Empire. By 1916, the Eastern Front had settled into a bloody stalemate. Russian forces, despite their vast manpower, were suffering from poor leadership, inadequate equipment, and low morale. The failures of previous offensives, including the catastrophic defeat at Gorlice-Darno, had shaken the confidence of both the army and the nation. Yet within this bleak situation, one man stood out as a beacon of competence and innovation: General Alexei Brusilov. Brusilov was a seasoned officer who understood that the traditional Russian approach of massed frontal assaults was a recipe for slaughter. He proposed a new strategy, one that emphasized surprise, careful planning, and flexibility. Rather than concentrating his troops in one area, Brusilov planned a broad, multi-front assault, spreading his forces across a wide front of nearly 300 miles. His intention was to keep the Austro-Hungarian defenders off balance, unable to predict where the main attack would fall. In preparation, Brusilov's men dug a vast network of trenches and saps, narrow, stealthy approach trenches, moving closer to the enemy lines without being detected. Artillery was carefully positioned, and instead of the usual prolonged bombardment, which would alert the enemy, Brusilov ordered a short but intense artillery barrage, designed to destroy the enemy's defenses without giving them time to reinforce. On June 4, 1916, the offensive began. Russian guns unleashed a ferocious bombardment on the Austro-Hungarian positions. But unlike previous Russian attacks, this bombardment was precise, targeting enemy trenches, communication lines, and strongpoints. Moments later, Russian infantry surged forward. Rather than advancing in massed waves, they attacked in smaller, flexible units, exploiting gaps in the shattered enemy lines. The Austro-Hungarian defenders were stunned. In many sectors, their trenches were overrun within hours. Panic spread through the Austrian ranks, and entire units were surrounded and captured. The Russian advance swept across Galicia, capturing key cities like Lutsk. In just the first few days, the Austro-Hungarian forces suffered tens of thousands of casualties, and entire divisions were annihilated. The success of the Brusilov offensive was not just a matter of tactical brilliance, it was also a testament to the courage and discipline of the Russian soldiers. These men, who had suffered so much in previous campaigns, now fought with a sense of purpose and momentum. The Austrian defenders, by contrast, were demoralized and divided, with the various nationalities of the Austro-Hungarian Empire struggling to maintain cohesion under the Russian assault. Desperate for help, the Austro-Hungarian command called upon their German allies. The Germans, who were already heavily engaged on the Western Front and at Verdun, were forced to divert divisions to the Eastern Front to stabilize the situation. This German intervention eventually slowed the Russian advance, but it came at a cost. German resources were stretched thinner, and the strain of defending their allies further weakened their position in the wider war. The Brusilov offensive inflicted catastrophic losses on the Austro-Hungarian army. Over 1 million Austro-Hungarian and German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Entire Austrian armies were shattered, and the Habsburg monarchy, already struggling with internal divisions, was left on the brink of collapse. For the Russians, it was a moment of triumph, a display of their military potential when properly led and supplied. Yet beneath the surface, all was not well. The Russian army, despite its successes, suffered enormous casualties of its own. The offensive had drained Russia's already fragile resources, and the failure of other Russian commanders to effectively support Brusilov's advance meant that the initial gains could not be fully exploited. The troops who had fought so bravely were soon exhausted, and supply lines broke down, leaving them vulnerable to counterattacks. Moreover, the Russian government was in turmoil. The Tsar's rule was increasingly seen as incompetent and corrupt, and the strains of the war were pushing the Russian economy and society to the breaking point. Within a year, the Russian Revolution would erupt, toppling the Tsar and plunging the country into chaos. For many Russian soldiers who had fought at Brusilov's side, their victories would be overshadowed by the suffering and betrayal that followed. The Brusilov offensive, for all its success, was a bittersweet victory. It revealed the strength of Russian soldiers when properly led, but it also highlighted the profound weaknesses of the Russian Empire. For Austria-Hungary, the defeat was a catastrophe from which it would never fully recover. For Germany, it was a reminder that even with their allies in the Central Powers, they were fighting a war of immense scale and cost. Today, the battlefields of Galicia, where the Russian troops surged forward under the relentless leadership of Brusilov, are quiet fields and forests. The graves of the fallen are scattered across the landscape, a silent testimony to a battle that brought glory but also agony. The Siege of Kut, a city of suffering. The Siege of Kut el Amara was one of the most harrowing episodes of World War I, a story of courage, starvation, and despair in the deserts of Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. For nearly 5 months, from December 1915 to April 1916, a British Indian force, led by Major General Charles Townshend, was surrounded by Ottoman troops in the town of Kut el Amara, enduring relentless bombardment, hunger, and disease. The roots of the siege lay in the British desire to seize Baghdad, a symbolically and strategically important city at the heart of the Ottoman Empire. Townshend's force, a mix of British and Indian soldiers, had advanced up the Tigris River with high hopes of capturing the city. But they were met with fierce resistance, and after suffering a severe defeat at the Battle of Ctesiphon in November 1915, Townshend was forced to retreat. His weary army withdrew to Kut, a small, defensible town on a bend of the Tigris River, where they hoped to regroup. But the Ottoman forces, commanded by the capable General Halil Pasha, saw an opportunity to deliver a devastating blow to the British. They surrounded Kut, cutting off all escape routes and beginning a methodical siege. The British, trapped and low on supplies, dug in and prepared to defend the town. At first, morale was relatively high. Townshend believed that a relief force from Basra would soon arrive to rescue them. But as the days turned to weeks, hope began to fade. The Ottoman troops, well supplied and bolstered by German military advisors, tightened their stranglehold on the town. Artillery shells rained down on the defenders, and Ottoman snipers made movement within the British lines a deadly risk. Yet the greater threat came not from enemy fire, but from starvation. The food supplies in Kut dwindled rapidly. Townshend had hoped to hold out for a month, but as January turned to February, the situation grew desperate. The relief efforts by the British command in Mesopotamia became a tragic saga of their own. Several attempts were made to break through the Ottoman lines and relieve the siege, but each one ended in failure. At the Battle of Hana in January 1916, thousands of British and Indian soldiers were killed or wounded in a futile assault against well-entrenched Ottoman positions. A later attempt, the Battle of Djala, also failed disastrously, leaving the men in Kut to their fate. Inside the besieged town, hunger turned to starvation. Soldiers and civilians alike were reduced to eating their horses, then their pack animals, and eventually stray dogs, rats, and leather from their own equipment. Disease swept through the weakened garrison, with dysentery, scurvy, and cholera claiming hundreds of lives. The dead were buried in shallow graves, and morale plummeted. Townshend, whose leadership had seemed bold at the start of the campaign, now appeared increasingly erratic. Isolated in his headquarters, he continued to send messages demanding rescue, even as his men died of hunger. His officers did their best to maintain discipline, but despair was everywhere. Letters from the besieged soldiers, smuggled out through Ottoman lines, spoke of their suffering and the sense of betrayal they felt. Desperate to save his men, Townshend tried to negotiate with the Ottoman commander, Halil Pasha. He offered money in exchange for safe passage for his troops, but Halil rejected the offer. The Ottoman command knew that they had the British trapped and that a major victory was within their grasp. On April 29, 1916, after 147 days of suffering, Townshend surrendered. Over 13,000 British and Indian soldiers became prisoners of war, many of whom would die in brutal captivity. For the British Empire, the loss of Kut was a humiliation. The siege had become a symbol of British arrogance, poor planning, and the futility of the Mesopotamian campaign. In London, the news of the surrender was met with shock and anger. Questions were asked in Parliament, and high-ranking officers in Mesopotamia were dismissed. The Ottoman victory at Kut, however, was bittersweet. Although they had captured an entire British force, the cost of the siege had been high. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers had died in the fighting, and the strain of the campaign contributed to the growing exhaustion of the Ottoman war effort. For the men who survived the siege, their suffering did not end with surrender. The prisoners were marched hundreds of miles to prison camps in Anatolia, where many perished from disease, starvation, and mistreatment. Those who lived carried the scars of their ordeal for the rest of their lives. Kut became a bitter memory for the British Army, a lesson in the dangers of overconfidence and the harsh realities of desert warfare. Yet it also revealed the courage and endurance of the ordinary soldiers who endured the unendurable. Their suffering, immortalized in memoirs and histories, became a poignant chapter in the epic tragedy of World War I. The Battle of Caporetto, a shattered front. The Battle of Caporetto, fought from October 24 to November 19, 1917, was one of the most devastating defeats suffered by the Italian army during World War I. What began as a seemingly ordinary battle along the Isonzo front quickly turned into a catastrophic rout, as German and Austro-Hungarian forces shattered the Italian lines, sending the Italian army into a desperate, chaotic retreat. It was a military disaster that nearly broke Italy's will to fight, but also one that transformed its army and its resolve. The Isonzo front, a rugged, mountainous region along the border between Italy and Austria-Hungary, had been the scene of brutal, grinding warfare since 1915. Italian General Luigi Cadorna had launched 11 bloody offensives in this region, each one marked by massive casualties and minimal gains. The Italian soldiers, fighting in the freezing cold of the mountains, suffered terribly, yet they fought with stubborn courage. But beneath the surface, the Italian army was cracking. Poor leadership, inadequate supplies, and low morale left many soldiers feeling abandoned. In October 1917, the Austro-Hungarian and German high commands decided to launch a major offensive to break the deadlock. The German commander, General Otto von Below, brought fresh, experienced troops to the front, including elite stormtroopers trained in new infiltration tactics. These troops would lead the attack, using speed, surprise, and precision to bypass Italian strongpoints and strike at the rear. The Italian command was completely unprepared for the scale and speed of the assault. In the early morning of October 24, the German and Austro-Hungarian forces unleashed a devastating artillery barrage, including poison gas shells, which choked the Italian defenders in their trenches. Then, without warning, the stormtroopers surged forward. Rather than attacking in rigid waves, they advanced in small, agile groups, exploiting gaps in the Italian lines. The Italian defenders, already weakened by poor supplies and low morale, were overwhelmed. Panic spread rapidly as news of the breakthrough reached the rear. In many sectors, Italian units simply broke and ran, abandoning their weapons and positions. Commanders lost control of their troops, and the roads leading south became choked with fleeing soldiers and civilians. The Austro-German forces advanced swiftly, capturing thousands of prisoners and vast quantities of supplies. In the midst of this chaos, there were also scenes of heroism and desperate resistance. Isolated Italian units, cut off from retreat, fought bravely to the last man. Italian Alpine troops, familiar with the mountainous terrain, staged stubborn rearguard actions, buying time for the main army to regroup. But for many, the retreat was a nightmare. Soldiers marched through freezing rain, many barefoot or starving, harried by enemy aircraft and artillery. General Cadorna, stunned by the disaster, issued orders that blamed his own troops for cowardice, further demoralizing them. But as the Italian army fell back to the Piave River, a new line of defense began to form. A new commander, General Armando Diaz, was appointed, and he quickly set about restoring discipline and morale. Harsh punishments were balanced with improved rations, rest periods, and a greater emphasis on caring for the troops. The Allies, alarmed by the Italian collapse, rushed reinforcements to the front. British and French divisions arrived to help stabilize the line, and the Italians, rallied by Diaz's leadership, dug in along the Piave River. There, in the shadow of the Alps, they prepared to make a stand. The cost of Caporetto was staggering. Over 300,000 Italian soldiers were taken prisoner, and another 400,000 fled in panic. Italy lost vast amounts of equipment, and the Isonzo front, for which so much blood had been shed, was abandoned. Yet from this disaster came a remarkable transformation. The Italian army, shocked into a sense of purpose, began to rebuild itself. General Diaz's reforms restored discipline and morale, and the troops, once driven by fear, now fought with a grim determination to defend their homeland. Caporetto also had a profound impact on Italy as a nation. For many Italians, the defeat was a moment of shame, but also a rallying cry. The slogan, "They shall not pass the Piave," became a symbol of defiance, and Italian poets and songwriters transformed the retreat into a story of tragic heroism. For the Austro-Hungarian and German armies, Caporetto was a stunning victory, but also a warning. The rapid advance stretched their supply lines, and the Italian resistance stiffened along the Piave. Germany, already struggling on the Western Front, could not afford to maintain a prolonged campaign in Italy. The battle also exposed the growing tensions within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where the various nationalities began to question their loyalty to the Habsburg monarchy. Today, the valleys and mountains of the Isonzo front are a quiet landscape, dotted with memorials to the men who fought and died there. Caporetto is remembered not just as a story of defeat, but as a turning point, a moment when the Italian army, facing destruction, found the will to stand and fight. The Arab Revolt, Lawrence of Arabia and the Desert War. The Arab Revolt of 1916 to 1918 was a dramatic and transformative chapter of World War I, a conflict fought not in the trenches of Europe but in the vast deserts of the Middle East. It was a struggle for independence, led by Arab nationalists against the Ottoman Empire, and it became legendary due in large part to the exploits of T. E. Lawrence, known to history as Lawrence of Arabia. But behind the romance and adventure lay a brutal, complex, and often tragic conflict that reshaped the Middle East. The revolt began in June 1916, when Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca and leader of the Hashemite family, declared a rebellion against Ottoman rule. Hussein had long chafed under Ottoman control, and with the promise of British support, including vague assurances of an independent Arab state after the war. He raised his banner of revolt in the Hijaz, the western coastal region of the Arabian Peninsula. His sons, Faisal and Abdullah, became the military leaders of the rebellion, leading a ragtag army of Bedouin tribesmen. At first, the revolt struggled. The Arab forces, lightly armed and poorly trained, faced a powerful Ottoman army with modern rifles, machine guns, and artillery. An initial attempt to capture the port city of Jeddah succeeded, but an assault on the Ottoman garrison at Medina turned into a bloody stalemate. Yet the Arabs were not alone. The British, who saw the revolt as a way to weaken the Ottoman Empire, an ally of Germany, provided money, weapons, and military advisors. Among these advisors was a young British intelligence officer named Thomas Edward Lawrence. Sent to Arabia in 1916, Lawrence quickly developed a close relationship with Prince Faisal, the charismatic leader of the Arab forces. Lawrence was not just an advisor, he became an active participant in the revolt, using his knowledge of Arab culture, language, and guerrilla tactics to turn the Bedouin warriors into an effective fighting force. Under Lawrence's guidance, the Arabs abandoned conventional warfare and embraced a strategy of guerrilla raids and sabotage. The Hijaz Railway, a vital Ottoman supply line running from Damascus to Medina, became their primary target. Time and again, Lawrence and his Arab allies struck at isolated Ottoman outposts, derailed trains, and destroyed tracks. The Ottoman soldiers, trapped in their garrisons, were harassed and starved, while the railway became a symbol of Ottoman impotence. Lawrence's role in the revolt became legendary, not only because of his daring exploits but also because of his extraordinary ability to inspire and unite the diverse and often fractious Arab tribes. He rode with the Bedouin across the burning deserts, dressed in flowing Arab robes, and became known to them as El Lawrence. His reports to British headquarters in Cairo were filled with colorful descriptions of the Desert War, and he quickly became a celebrated figure. But beneath the romance of the Desert War lay bitter realities. The Arab Revolt was not a simple struggle for freedom, it was a conflict riven by tribal rivalries, conflicting ambitions, and the shadowy intrigues of British imperial politics. While Lawrence believed in the Arab cause, the British government had other plans. Unknown to the Arabs, Britain and France had secretly signed the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916, which divided the Middle East into spheres of influence, effectively betraying the promise of Arab independence. As the war dragged on, the Arab forces, led by Faisal and Lawrence, advanced northwards. They captured the strategic port of Aqaba in a dramatic overland assault in July 1917, bypassing the Ottoman defences and seizing the city with minimal losses. This victory transformed the revolt from a local uprising into a major campaign. The Arab army, now bolstered by British gold and supplies, pushed towards Damascus. In September 1918, as British General Edmund Allenby launched a major offensive in Palestine, the Arab forces struck from the desert, capturing the key city of Deira and cutting the Ottoman lines of retreat. The Ottoman army, already reeling from British attacks, collapsed. On October 1, 1918, Arab troops entered Damascus, the ancient capital of Syria. Lawrence rode at the head of the column alongside Prince Faisal, a symbol of the Arab dream of independence. But that dream was soon shattered. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, the victorious Allies carved up the Ottoman territories, and the promises of independence made to the Arabs were ignored. Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Palestine were placed under British and French control as League of Nations mandates. Faisal, the hero of the revolt, briefly became king of Syria, but was deposed by the French. He was later made king of Iraq by the British, a hollow victory for a man who had fought for a united Arab state. For Lawrence, the betrayal of the Arabs was a bitter disillusionment. He withdrew from public life, haunted by his role in the revolt and the fate of his Arab allies. In his memoir, 7 Pillars of Wisdom, he wrote of the Desert War with both pride and regret, describing the courage and suffering of the Arab warriors and the broken promises that followed their victory. The Arab revolt left a deep mark on the history of the Middle East. It was the birth of Arab nationalism, but it was also the beginning of a long struggle for true independence, a struggle that would continue for decades. The lines drawn by European diplomats in Paris became the borders of new states, but they also became the seeds of future conflicts. Today, the old Hijaz Railway lies in ruins, a rusting relic of a vanished empire. But the memory of the Arab revolt endures, a story of courage and betrayal, of desert warriors and their enigmatic English ally, and of a dream of freedom that was never truly fulfilled. As the smoke cleared and the guns fell silent, the world stood in the shadow of devastation. Millions had perished, empires had crumbled, and the scars of the Great War would linger for generations. But within the darkness, there were stories of courage, of brotherhood, of sacrifice. Stories that remind us that even in the depths of human conflict, there is light. These stories are not just echoes of the past, they are a mirror to the human spirit, a testament to endurance and hope. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the stories of World War I. If their voices have moved you, if their struggles have touched you, let them not be forgotten. Until next time, remember, the past is never truly gone. It lives on in the stories we tell.